Alright, Forgotten Soldier continues. It's cold. A lot happening here. Get ready. We are in the Belgorod chapter. And if you know about that, hold your horses, because it's getting crazy. Page 183. Here goes. Suddenly, I began to shake uncontrollably. Not precisely because of fear, but because at that moment when our mission was about to be accomplished, all the nervousness and anxiety which I had been able to master until then burst out in violent spasms. I tried shifting my weight. But nothing did any good. I managed to open up the magazine and nervously slipped the first belt into the breech of the gun, which the veteran held open for me, and left partly open, to prevent the sound of its clicking shut. Far to our left, the dance had already begun. A dance which would surely have inspired sajer, which lasted for days. A moment later, among the German troops we were watching, someone must have pulled a wire attached to a string of mines. Our immediate surroundings, the Russian position, the bodies of Grumpers and his adversary, our little hill, and all our hearts were shaken by a series of thunderous explosions. For a moment, we thought that the whole mass of creeping soldiers we had seen just the minute before had been blown to pieces. Everywhere among the Hitlerjugend, for it was they who had been crawling toward us, young men were jumping up and trying to rush through the tangles of barbed wire. Howells had just opened fire. The veteran slammed our gun shut and fitted it with the hollow of his shoulder. "Fire!" shouted the non-com. "Wipe them out!" The Russians ran to take their places. A string of 7.7 cartridges slid through my hands with brutal rapidity, while the noise of the gun burst against my eardrums. I could see what was happening only with the greatest difficulty. The Spandau was shuddering and jumping on its legs and shaking the veteran, who kept trying to steady himself. Its percussive bark put a final touch on the vast din which had broken out. Through the vibrations and smoke, we were able to observe the horrible impact of our projectiles on the lost mass of Russian soldiers in the trench in front of us. Day broke over the frenzied scene, and the sky slowly lightened. From far behind us, German artillery was roaring through every tube, pounding the enemy's secondary positions. The Russians, taken by surprise, were attempting a desperate defense, but from every side, the Jugendlichen were surging out of the darkness, breaking like waves over their entrenchments and pulverizing both men and materiel. An overwhelming din engulfed the plain, which rang with the sound of thousands of explosions. Ahead of us, and far to the right, we were bombarding a town of considerable size. Slow spirals of smoke some 50 yards across rolled along the ground from enormous fires. I was feeding a second magazine into our infernal machine, and the veteran continued to pour his projectiles onto the dead and living who were jammed into the advanced positions. Then, through all the noise, we heard the unmistakable rumble of tanks. "Our panzers!" shouted the Czech with demoniac laugh. Hals left his position and rushed toward us with a leap which made us think he'd been hit. He and Lindbergh had just run out of time. A second later, a huge tank rolled over the ground they had occupied, crushing the barbed wire beneath its treads. The churned up earth continued to shake with the explosion of mines, which here and there immobilized a heavy armor vehicle or tossed a Lancer some 15 yards. The tank, followed by two others, passed very close to us, thrusting toward the enemy positions we had already peppered for several minutes. In no time, it had crossed the trench, which was overflowing with the bodies of Russian soldiers. Then a second and third tank plunged through the bloody paste and rolled on, their treads struck with horrible human remnants. Our non-com gave an involuntary cry of horror at the sight. Soon the young soldiers, fresh from the sportive pleasures of the barracks, would arrive at this foul reality. We heard a cry of horror, followed by one of victory, as the first assault wave continued its advance. More tanks were pouring out of the woods behind us, crushing the saplings and brush, and driving, almost rearing up on their treads, toward companies of infantry who had to hurry out of the way. If there were any wounded lying on the ground, that was their bad luck. The first phased attack was supposed to occur like a flash of lightning, with nothing permitted to hinder the progress of the tanks. An infantry group had just joined us, and their leader was talking with ours when a tank bore down exactly on our position. Everyone jumped aside. A young soldier ran toward the tank, trying to wave it off with large gestures, but the monster continued unswervingly like a blind animal, churning up the ground a bare 2 yards from our hillock. In my haste, my foot caught on the spandau, and I felt the full length down the other side of the rise. The huge machine flattened the edge of our protection, and the steel section of its treads rolled past, horribly close to my haggard eyes. What happened next? I retain nothing from those terrible minutes except indistinct memories, which flashed in my mind from sudden brutality, like apparitions amongst bursts and steams and visions that are scarcely imaginable. It is difficult even to try to remember moments during which nothing is considered, foreseen, or understood, when there is nothing under a steel helmet but an astonishingly empty head and a pair of eyes which translate nothing more than with the eyes of an animal facing mortal danger. There is nothing but the rhythm of explosions, more or less distant, more or less violent, and the cries of madmen, to be classified later, according to the outcome of the battle, as the cries of heroes or of murderers. And there are the cries of the wounded, of the agonizingly dying, shrieking as they stare at a part of their body reduced to pulp. The cries of men touched by the shock of battle before anybody else, who run in any and every direction, howling like banshees. There are the tragic, unbelievable visions which carry from one moment of nausea to another. Guts splattered across the rubble and sprayed from one dying man into another. Tightly riveted machines ripped like the belly of a cow which has just been sliced open. Flaming and groaning, trees broken into tiny fragments, gaping windows pouring out torrents of billowing dust, dispersing into oblivion all that remains of a comfortable parlor. And then there are the cries of officers and non-coms trying to shout across the cataclysm to regroup their sections and companies. That is how we took part in the German advance, being called through the noise and dust, following the clouds churned up by our tanks to the northern outskirts of Belgorod. All resistance was overwhelmed, and once again, everything was either German or dead, and a sea of Russian soldiers had drawn back into the limitless confines of their country. There were thousands of prisoners, including the pro-Germans, who immediately placed in their hands of our different soldiers lists of those we should shoot. There was the park of Russian vehicles hiding 2,000 or 3,000 enemy soldiers determined to slow our advance, and the spandau into which the veteran and I continued to feed cartridges, and Hall's spandau, and the one attached to Group 10, decimated and reformed, firing and laughing as they fired in vengeance for their fallen comrades. We sent a rain of anti-tank shells into the park and listened to the howls of the Russians, who no longer dared to move or surrender or attack. before flames devoured the area and forced us to retire from the unbearable heat. Toward noon, the Soviets began to retaliate and rained a devastating fire on the rising waves of Schungenlohen. But nothing stopped the young lions, even for a moment, and the burned-out ruin of Belgrade fell into the hands of their survivors on the second evening. In a heady state, near delirium, we went on, with almost no rest, to enlarge the wedge of our troops had driven into the mass of the Soviet Central Front, a front of 150,000 men. According to our so-called information services, in fact closer to 400,000 or 500,000 Russians were jostled back by 60,000 Germans. By the evening of the third day of continuous battle, during which we had only been able to snatch an occasional half an hour's sleep, we were seized by the furious strength of madmen. Our group had lost both the Czech and the sergeant, and as they lay either dead or wounded among the ruins, 2 grenadiers who had lost their units joined us. We were now split into 3 groups, including the 11th, in which Ollensheim was still alive, and the 17th, which had rejoined us, jointly commanded by a lieutenant. We had been ordered to reduce the pockets of resistance in the ashes of a suburb called Troika, if I remember correctly, enclaves which continued to defend themselves, although they had been left behind by the retreating Soviet forces. Our faces, streaked with dust and filth and sweat, stared across the ruined, apocalyptic landscape through which we were advancing, more interested in quiet corners for a few moments of sleep than in Russian strays. Explosions from the forefront of our advance were continuously shaking the air around us and compressing our weakened lungs. No one spoke, except for an occasional halt or Achtung, which threw us down onto the burning ground. We were so exhausted that we stood up only when our fire had subdued the isolated and hopeless resistance from some entrenched hole. Sometimes 1 or 2 prisoners might emerge from their hideout with their hands in the air, and each time the same tragedy repeated itself. Kraus killed 4 of them on the lieutenant's orders, the Sudeten 2, Group 17 9, young Lindbergh, who had been in a state of panic ever since the beginning of the offensive, and who had either been weeping in terror or laughing in hope, took Kraus's machine gun and shoved 2 Bolsheviks into a shell hole. The 2 wretched victims were both a good deal older than the boy and kept imploring for mercy. We could hear the desperate shouts for a long time, but Lindbergh, in a paroxysm of uncontrollable rage, kept firing until they were quiet. Then there was the bread house, so called because after the massacre we found a few wretched biscuits there, which we devoured, hoping to extract some return for the horrors which the wars forced upon us. We were mad with harassment and exhaustion, running on our nerves, which were stretched to the utmost, and which only could be possible to respond to the endless succession of crises and alerts. We were forbidden to take prisoners until our return trip. We knew that the Russians didn't take any, and although we longed for sleep, we knew that we had to stay awake as long as there were any Bolsheviks in our sector. It was either them or us, which is why my friend Hals and I threw grenades into the bread house at some Russians who were trying to wave a white flag. When we reached the end of our sweep, we collapsed at the bottom of a large crater and stared at each other for a long time in dazed silence. None of us could speak. Our uniforms were unbuttoned, torn, or too permeated with dust that they were the color of the ground. The air still roared and shook and smelled of burning. 4 more of our men had been killed, and we were dragging along 5 or 6 wounded, one of them Ollensheim, There were about 20 of us huddled into that huge hole, trying to put our thoughts into some kind of order, but our stupefied eyes continued to wander vacantly over the burned landscape, and our heads remained empty. The radio announced that our Belgorod offensive had been crowned with success and marked the beginning of our further progress eastward. By the fourth or fifth evening, we had gone through Belgorod without even knowing it. Our assault troops were catching their breath, and numerous ranks of infantry were sleeping on the great battered plain. We were soon loaded onto a truck and driven to a key position. I didn't understand why the ruined hamlet where we were put was considered strategic, but grasped that this was one of the places from which the next phase of our offensive would be launched. The gently rolling landscape of fat-bellied orchards and willow-bordered streams and the irrigation canals reminded me somehow of Normandy. It was occupied either by lines of offense or by rallying points for our assault troops. We began to organize our position among the poor, half-ruined houses of the hamlet. Our first job was to get rid of some 30 Bolshevik corpses scattered through the rubble. We dumped them in a small garden, which must once have been cultivated. The day was hot and heavy. A greasy sun threw sharp shadows and made us squint in the harsh light, which emphasized every hollow of our exhausted faces. The same light poured down onto the faces of the dead Russians, whose fixed eyes were opened inordinately wide. Looking at them and thinking about it all made my stomach turn. "Isn't it funny?" the Sudetan remarked calmly. "How quickly a fellow's beard grows when he's dead. Look at this one." He turned over the body with his foot. The man's tunic was torn by 7 or 8 bloody holes. "He probably shaved yesterday, just before he was killed. Look at him now. He's got a beard on him that would take him at least a week otherwise." "See this one?" laughed another fellow, who was clearing out a building which had been hit by a heavy mortar shell. He was dragging a Russian soldier whose head had been blown off. "You'd do better to go and shave yourself if you want anyone to recognize you when it's your turn. You give me a pain with your idiotic remarks. Anyone would think that this is the first stiff you've ever seen." The veteran sat down on a heap of rubble and opened his mess tin. We found a cellar, which made a perfect defense point, and moved into it with our 2 machine guns. We dug out the air vent, which had been blocked by the collapse of the building, and even enlarged it, stopping work for a moment to watch a flight of Stukas pass overhead. Somewhere, not too far away, Ivan must have been drenched by a rain of bombs. Howells had made a hole in the masonry walls and was estimating the firing possibilities. Lindenberg was almost jubilant to be setting up this precarious shelter. Everything which now seemed to be working to our advantage stirred him to a strange excitement, in contrast to the helpless fear of the flaming alleys of Belgorod, which had reduced him to whining and pissing in his pants. 3 yards away, the veteran and I were shoving in supports to brace the enlarged air vent, which at best seemed a shaky position. Whenever we moved, our helmets scraped against the low ceiling. Behind us, Kraus and 2 other grenadiers were removing the falling stones and rubble which littered the floor. One of them picked up an empty bottle and, with a civilian reflex, stood it against the wall to wait for the harvest. As I've said, we had lost our non-com, and the veteran, who was an Obergefreiter, was now commanding our group. However, we were still under the orders of a fat Stabsfeldwebel, who directed all 3 groups and who was killed 2 days later. The bastard checked our work with all the airs of a superior officer, forcing us to check this detail or that, unaware that he had only 48 hours to live. We spent the day waiting and watching companies of sweating troops march by against a continuous background of heavy explosions and a variety of other noises. It was in precisely these moments that everything became intensely painful. As we slowly regained our spirits, we began to grasp what had happened to us. It suddenly struck us that our non-com and grumpers and the Czech and the wounded boy abandoned to his fate were in fact no longer with us. We tried to blot out the memory of the Russian trench we had machine gunned, and the tanks driving heavily over that moving mass of human flesh, and Deptroyka with its piles of Bolshevik corpses, and the hammering of enemy artillery in the narrow straits crammed with Hitlerjugend, all the appalling, inexplicable details. We suddenly felt gripped by something horrible which made our skins crawl and our hair stand on ends. For me, these memories produced a loss of physical sensation, almost as if my personality had split. I knew that I was actually incapable of such experiences, not because I was superior to other people, but because I knew that such things didn't happen to young men who had led normal lives more or less like others people's. The grenadiers, 3 of them, stood talking by the staircase. The veteran, alone by the air vent, through which floods of sunlight poured into the room, was going through his pockets, spreading out the wretch's contents on a flat stone. Hals, who had curled his big body into a rough bench and was lying silent, while Lindbergh and Sudeten were staring through holes in the walls, with their minds clearly far away. I went over to Hals and lay down beside him. We stared at each other for a moment, unable to speak. "What the hell are we doing here?" Hals said finally. His face had grown noticeably harder since Bialystok. I limited myself to a gesture of innocence. "I'd like to sleep, but I can't," he said. "Yes, it's just as hot in here as outside." "Let's go out anyway." We went out, took a few steps. The light was blinding. "Maybe there's some cold water over there," I said, pointing to an orchard divided by a thin stream. "I'm not thirsty, not hungry either," Hals answered to my great surprise. I was used to his enormous appetite. "Are you sick?" "No, I just feel like vomiting. I'm so tired, and those fellows over there don't help either." He nodded at the 30 putrefied corpses in the little garden. "That's always how it is, with fellows who won't make any more trouble," I answered in a tone which still surprises me. "Others were picked up before we got here. There's some freshly turned ground just inside the village. I don't know how many they were able to stuff in there. Do you know how many we've had killed already?" We were silent for a moment. "We'll probably be relieved soon, Hals." "Yes," he said, "I hope so. We really were shits to kill those Popovs in the bread house." He was clearly desperately troubled by the same things that troubled me. "The bread house is how it is, and all there is," I answered. I could still feel the cartridges running through my hands, see them entering the Spandau, and seeing the bluish smoking metal of the barrel and the sparks that flew out each time the gun fired, painfully striking my hands and face, and hear the shrieks penetrating the infernal din and the cries for help. "Pomosh! Pomosh!" Something hideous had entered our spirits to remain and haunt us forever. It was broad daylight, but we had no idea what time it was. Was it still morning? Was it afternoon? It didn't matter. Everyone ate and drank where he could, slept where he could, and tried to think whenever he could take off his helmet. It's strange how a helmet interferes with thought. It was still daylight when an enemy barrage ripped into the orchards. And the advancing troops, who had stopped only a short distance from us, we dived into our cellar shelter and stared anxiously at the ceiling, which rained down plaster with each explosion. "We'll have to shore it up too," said the veteran. "If anything lands too close, the whole thing will come down on our heads." The bombardment lasted for at least 2 hours. The few Soviet shells fell right beside us, but they were clearly intended for the assault troops. Our big guns answered them, and all other sounds were drowned in the noise of artillery. Shells from our howitzer were shooting right over our ruin, contributing as much to the collapse of our ceiling as the Russian shells, which sometimes burst less than 30 yards away. During the bombardment, we were all gripped by an extreme and exhausting tension. Some of us attempted predictions, only to be contradicted by events a few moments later. The veterans smoked nervously, continuously begging us to shut up. Krause had drawn apart and sat muttering in a corner. Perhaps he was praying. In the evening, one of the counterattack units visited us and installed an anti-tank gun nearby. A colonel came by a little later and tested the new supports we'd put in to prevent any further collapse of the roof. "Well done," he said. He made the rounds of our little group, offering each man a cigarette. Then he rejoined his unit, which was part of the Gross Deutschland, a little closer to the front. It grew dark. Through the tattered silhouettes of the remaining orchard trees, the horizon glowed red with fire. The battle was not yet over, and the extreme tension it generated was almost unbearable. We had to take turns standing guard outside, and no one had a good night's sleep. We were rounded up well before dawn and forced to abandon our well-organized hole and proceed further into Soviet territory. The German advance had not been stopped. During our advance, we crossed a frightful slaughtering ground of Hitlerjugend, mixed into the dirt by the bombardment of the day before. Each step made us realize with fresh horror what could become of our miserable flesh. "Somebody should have buried all this mincemeat so we wouldn't have to look at it," Howells grumbled. Everybody laughed as if he just said something funny. We crossed a piece of ground so heavily pitted with shell holes, it was hard to imagine that anyone who'd been on it could have survived. And an open-air hospital behind an embankment through which the shrieks and groans came so thick and fast as it sounded like a scalding room for pigs. We were staggered by what we saw. I thought I would faint. Lindbergh was crying with horror. We crossed the enclosure with our eyes fixed on the sky, seeing as if in a dream young men howling with pain, whose crushed forearms or gaping abdominal wounds staring with incomprehension at their own guts, puffing out the pieces of cloth which had been hastily flung over them. Immediately behind the hospital, we were able to wade into a canal. The cool water which rose over our waist made us feel much better. On the far bank, the springing turf was strewn with Russian bodies. A Soviet tank, twisted and blackened by fire, stood beside a gun and shattered bodies of its operators. To our left, in the northeast, the battle continued more fiercely than ever. We thought we heard a groan from one of the Russian gunners and went over to a man smeared with blood who was leaning, gasping against one of the wheels of the gun carriage. One of our men uncorked his drinking bottle and lifted the head of the dying man. The Russian stared at us through enormous eyes, widened by terror or shock. He cried out, and then his head fell back, thudding against the metal of the wheel. He was dead. We continued across a series of rolling wooded hills where our frontline troops were regrouping and catching a moment's rest in the shade of the trees. Many men wore bandages whose whiteness stood out sharply against the gray, dusty faces. We were rapidly regrouped, called out, and sent to precise locations. The 2 grenadiers who had joined us were sent somewhere else, while our 8th group was completed by a new pair of strangers. Unfortunately, the Stabsfeldwebel, whom I mentioned before, and who had only one more day to live, was made the leader of our group. We were swiftly attached to an armor section which transported us to the backs of their machine guns to the edge of an enormous plateau which seemed to stretch into infinity.